Hello, BookTube, and welcome at last to Book Trek 2023, the summer of Trek, when I and the captain and crew of the USS Revenant are celebrating Star Trek fiction all throughout the summer. June, July, and August. How wonderful. And Book Trek this year, unlike previous years, is largely structureless. It's just read Star Trek all summer long, which I think the warm, sunny days of summer are perfect for Star Trek. Perfect for seeing it in the theater, perfect for watching it on TV, and perfect for reading the books. So the timing couldn't be better for me, and I'm really enjoying the structuralist nature of this sort of thing. In previous years, we've looked at individual iterations of Star Trek or time periods or whatnot. Here you can go anywhere. Just read about Star Trek. You can either read Star Trek fiction, there's an endless amount of it, or you can do away missions, where you read either a work of science, popular science, or you read a work of nonfiction, a memoir, for instance, written by a Star Trek person, either a production hand or a star or something like that. Just wonderfully wide open, like the Alpha Quadrant. And I chose as my first thing to read for Book Trek 2023 the Star Trek novels of James Blish. Not the novels, the Star Trek story collections of James Blish. These will be very, very familiar to most old-school, original Star Trek fans, because these, for a long time, were everywhere, and they were the only things that you could get in the bookstores. They had this distinctive look, they had original artwork, except for the first three. This is a studio still, but the 2 and 3, Star Trek's 2 and 3 have photos from production stills. The rest of them have original artwork, and some of it is lovely. These original volumes here, look at that. That is just beautiful. That is just beautiful Star Trek painting. And a lot of them have that. They're just lovely. These original mass market paperbacks are what I decided would be my first Book Trek project. I've read these a million times. They were, for a long time, like I said, the only Star Trek you could get in book form. And I thought I'd go at them again this time for Book Trek and really bear down on them for a couple of reasons. One, because these were pretty much my introduction to Star Trek fiction. I think for a lot of people who were original series fans, they were. I couldn't get enough of the original series. It blew me away. I remember the exact moment, the exact episode and the exact moment where I thought, okay, I haven't seen this in science fiction on TV before. This is for adults. And it's not cheesy. And it's not dumb. And it wasn't long after that initial moment that I wanted Star Trek fiction, that I wanted to read it, being an indefatigable book person. And these are what we had. Before Star Trek novels started to take off, before you started, there came a time, years and years after this, where you could get, 20 Star Trek novels in a year, more than that. But that was once Star Trek proved itself a viable franchise, a very, very viable franchise. These things were coming out when it wasn't viable. It had been canceled and brought back by fans. It had been moved around on its weekly schedule. And the actors and actresses, the writers and producers on board, they didn't know the future. They had no idea that $1 billion franchise was coming out of all this. So we only had these things. And therefore, they have a permanent place of affection in my Star Trek reader's heart, as I bet they do in a lot of hearts. I've encountered these in many, many forms. Up over my shoulder, you can almost see the Science Fiction Book Club Star Trek volumes, hardcover, 4 volumes of these that don't include this. They don't include the stories in Star Trek 1. They include everything else. Also, just comparatively recently, just a few years ago, Barnes & Noble made a Star Trek volume of their leather-bound classics, reprinting probably half the stories that you would get in the whole of this run, the whole of these books, picking and choosing, so you don't get all of them. I've read them and reread them in all of those formats. I've gone back to them over and over again, and I know their limitations. And I'm under the impression right now that the limitations are twofold. One is that James Blish didn't know anything about Star Trek when he wrote these. He was being given packets of information from the studio. Shooting scripts, preliminary shooting scripts, the series Bible as it was unfolding. But not anything like the sense of it. I don't think that James Blish, certainly when he wrote this Star Trek book, he wasn't a Star Trek fan. I'd be willing to bet that he hadn't much heard about it. I think he became one later on, but either way, he didn't have anything to go on. He didn't have what we now recognize with 50 years of hindsight are the true natures of these characters, the true natures of the Federation or a Trek story. Instead, he was just bashing out stuff on a deadline. And that's one of the reasons why these things, for me, have never quite ignited, why they've never quite worked, like the shuttle bay is igniting there. The other reason is James Blish himself, who I have never really liked as a science fiction author. I've read a lot of his stuff. Over the years, I've read a lot of his stuff. Of course, I've given more than one try to Cities in Flight or A Case of Conscience, and never thought it was anything more than just C grade. And occasionally, I would get pushback from that, especially from science fiction writers who knew James Blish, and especially from science fiction writers who weren't American. And it's been nagging in the back of my mind that maybe I need to revisit the science fiction of James Blish, not the Star Trek fiction, but the science fiction. So those two things: one, to go at all of these books, one more time for Book Trek 2023, and the other to sort of use them as a launch pad to go at James Blish's science fiction, his non-Star Trek science fiction. So I went through all of these books. I went through those hardcovers up on the shelf, and I went through all of these great old paperbacks that just cannot be beat. They just cannot be beat. In fact, let me hold up my favorite cover while I'm talking about this, just because I don't know that I'll be talking about James Blish's Star Trek ever again for Book Trek. I read through all of these, and I knew what to expect. I knew the limitations to expect. Boy, oh boy, though. I always forget how limited these things are. It's not just that James Blish had only shooting scripts to go on. It's also that he is a pedestrian writer. Give these same shooting scripts to another writer at the time, and I can think of half a dozen writers working in the field when Blish was writing these things that would have done a much, much better job. Instead, these are barely formed things at all. Most of them are barely formed things at all. And what's worse, they have two huge drawbacks. One is that they are not Star Trek. Our characters are not in character, which is an odd thing to say for fiction, but not for pastiche fiction. For fiction, if you cannot look at Brothers Karamazov and say, well, the Brothers Karamazov are not in character. Dostoevsky made them. If he says they're in character, they're in character. This is not like that. This is pastiche fiction, which means you can get the characters wrong. And Blish consistently does. He consistently gets the characters wrong. Now, whether that's just a bad guess on his part, or guessing is all it could be. His Kirk is never Kirk. He's never our Kirk. His Spock is never our Spock, especially. Spock is the big weak point here. But also his Dr. McCoy is never Dr. McCoy. There's the story made from the episode The Enemy Within, Richard Matheson's The Enemy Within, where a transporter accident splits Kirk into doubles, one of which is kind and meek and gentle, and the other which is a savage animal. And the savage animal goes prowling around the Enterprise, and once they find him, they have to engage in a risky transporter remelding because Kirk has Sulu and three crewmen down on a planet freezing to death. They need the transporters to be in working operation to get them back, but the only way to know whether or not the transporters are in working operation is to fix this problem. It's a really dumb episode from any kind of a science fiction point of view. It's utterly ridiculous that you don't have moral halves and immoral halves to your body. It's just ridiculous that would be true. It's not ridiculous that it would ever happen, and it's one of many Star Trek stories where if it did happen, it would be utterly impossible to fix. But nevertheless, Kirk is desperate because he has crewmen freezing to death down on the planet, and he insists that he go through the transporter with his evil double and see if they can reblend the two together. And Mr. Spock, he has a conversation with Spock and McCoy, and Spock is assuring him that technologically he has examined the parameters and it is likely that it will work. And McCoy is telling him it's not worth the risk. You could die, and you won't be helping the crew members down on that planet anymore if you're dead. Let us do some tests. Let us wait and see and test it. And in that scene, McCoy says that to Kirk, your life is more precious than those four men down on the planet. You might not like that, but it's true. Bones McCoy would never say that. It's not just, that's one element where these things fail, and fail consistently, right to the end, they fail. By the time Blish was writing Star Trek 10, 11, and 12, he was able to watch the show. He must have known his job gets a little bit better, but not enough, not anywhere close. In Star Trek 11, 12, he's still making these same mistakes, which by then we have to chalk them up as mistakes, because he must have known by then the kind of performance that the actors were turning in. He was hampered by that, not only by, I think, bad judgment, but also by the second factor, which is that he was not getting the on-the-fly scripting improvements that were done to these episodes during filming. And sometimes those are enormous, absolutely enormous changes that go on. There's an episode, a great episode called The Naked Time, for instance, where the Enterprise brings on board a strange new virus that's almost undetectable and that brings out the hidden inclinations, the hidden insecurities in anyone who comes in contact with it. And that's the episode where Lieutenant Riley, who fancies himself the descendant of Irish kings, locks himself in engineering and shuts off the engines so that the Enterprise being pulled down to the death spirals of a dying planet. They have to cut their way through the door to get at Riley, to get him to turn the engines back on. But as they're trying to do that, more and more crew members are getting infected, including Mr. Spock. And in the book, in the short story that Blish is doing, Mr. Spock is on the bridge, tells Captain Kirk, "I feel ill," and asks for permission to go to his quarters. And he does. And they figure out a way to open the engineering doors, and Dr. McCoy works out a cure, and they restart the engines, and they pull away from the planet. And the story that Blish is adapting ends with them hearing over the intercom. They try to contact Mr. Spock in his quarters, and they hear him singing in Vulcan. And it's kind of a funny ending. It's kind of a funny ending that a Spock with no inhibitions is going to sing in Vulcan. It won't be horrible sound. It's all screechy and whatnot. Compare that to the changes that were made to Naked Time for the finished program, in which not only has Riley shut the engines off so that they can't be restarted, where Scotty immortally tells Kirk that I've got to have 13 minutes. I cannot change the laws of physics. Not only that, but since Kirk desperately now needs a cold start formula for the warp engines, he goes to find Mr. Spock, who is not in his quarters. He's in a briefing room. And he's crying, saying that his mother was a human woman trapped on a world Vulcan where love is bad taste. He could never tell her that he loved her. Kirk stands him up and starts shaking him, saying, "We need a formula. You're the only one who can do it. The computers need more time. You have to do this." And Spock tells Kirk, "When I feel affection for you, friendship for you, I'm ashamed." And Kirk slaps him. And then slaps him again. And says, "We need a formula." And Spock says, "It's never been done." He's trying to claw his way back to control of his own emotions. And Kirk says, "Stop telling me that, science officer. I need a formula." And he belts him again. And that's one too many times for Mr. Spock, who strikes him back and knocks him across the room. Because the writer on set, hallowed be her name, remembered that Mr. Spock is 3 or 4 times stronger than Kirk. So he belts Kirk and it sends him flying. And it's a wonderful moment. Absolutely wonderful. Where they face each other. Kirk has now been infected. He's been touched by Mr. Spock, so he's been infected. And he starts to bemoan how lonely he is. How he has a braid on his shoulder, but the ship just takes and takes, and he gives and gives. And he's in the midst of this aria of self-pity and insecurity when Scotty comes through the door, and he lunges forward and says, "Scotty, help." And then he starts to control himself and tells them, "Clear the corridors." He doesn't want his crew to see him like this. It's all wonderful, every element of it. And it's not in this. It's not in the story here is dumb. It's just a trivial, dumb little story. Same thing with Balance of Terror, the great episode where Kirk is matching wits with a largely unseen Romulan foe until the very end. The story that Blish is adapting has an utterly unsatisfying ending, just shorn of all the human dignity, all the alien dignity that Mark Leonard gives it as the Romulan commander. Talking about how in a different reality I could have called you friend. Reading these stories again reinforced my oft-stated goal, my plea for years, that Paramount allow other writers to write these stories. No offense meant to James Blish. He's long gone. He's long past caring. We all have soft, sentimental spots in our hearts for these collections and these stories, and we should. Let's let them happen. Let's leave them there. Here we have That's the cover that's given for Who Mourns for Adonis. The James Blish adaptation here in this collection very famously includes the ending of Who Mourns for Adonis, where the Enterprise crew meets the god Apollo. James Blish didn't know that the censors, that the network had said that the original ending for that episode cannot possibly be done on network TV, because the original ending is that Lieutenant Palamas is pregnant. Apollo has impregnated one of Kirk's crew members. The scene in the show makes it completely unavoidable. You know exactly what's happening, but they left it out. But James Blish didn't leave it out of his adaptation. But I have often said we have these volumes, and we love them. For all their flaws, even I love them. But these stories deserve to be written again. By somebody else. One episode per novel. Not a collection of 6 or 7 or 8 stories, but a novel of A Case of Conscience, a novel of Requiem for Methuselah, a novel of City on the Edge of Forever. You put out the word to the science fiction community that we want novels of each of these episodes. We want you to fill them with star dates, fill them with context, fill them with character and personality. You can't violate the text of the broadcast episode. You can definitely violate the scripts, but you can't violate the text of the broadcast episodes, but you can add plenty. As long as it doesn't contradict what's on the screen, you can add plenty and give it as much texture and context as you like. They would have 100,000 volunteers in a day. And some of those volunteers would be the foremost names in science fiction. Isaac Asimov begged and pleaded to be able to do exactly this 30 years ago. Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury also begged and pleaded with the Edgar Rice Burroughs Corporation to be able to write Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. For some reason, studios always say no to these things. I don't understand it. Almost always say no. And so we don't have that. We should. Paramount has almost no business. It does almost no business in Star Trek novels now. I don't think it ever will again. So why not tap into the loyal core of fans who would buy these things and come out with a novel every let's say, twice a year. 2 episodes. So a novel dramatizing the whole of one episode, then the second half of the year, another novel doing that. Why not do that? And get whoever to write them. Oh my God, it would be so much fun. It would be so wonderful, especially if you filtered in all later developments. Maybe they could be footnotes in those novels. Star Trek fans would eat that up. Anyway, that's my initial foray into Book Trek 2023, is to reread the James Blish adaptations of the teleplays. I'm not reading Spock Must Die. So I'm just reading this James Blish, both to revisit these stories and also to revisit James Blish as a writer. And it kind of sort of failed in both regards. I'm still going to continue with my project of reading all of James Blish so I can get my hands on. But I don't know if I'll reread these stories again. Certainly not like this, where I'm sitting down with them, pencil in hand, and looking at what is wrong and what could be done right, even within the constraints of what Blish was working with. That's a lot. But that's my first foray, and because Book Trek, Summer of Trek is so informal, I don't know where I'm going to go tonight. No idea what my next Book Trek report will be. You'll find out. I'll make a video then, and we shall see. And I will reconnoiter with you all then. Until then, live long and prosper. I will see you soon, Book Trek.